Well, kia ora tātou everyone, nau mai haere mai ki tēnei kōrero. My name's Brendan Lane. I'm the campaign organiser for the Let's Do Even Better campaign, and it's lovely to have you here joining us for one of our election panel discussions. There's been heaps of policy come out recently. We're really excited to get down and delve into it and find out what's being promised and look a bit below the surface and see what the substance is there. So joining me today, we've got three fantastic guests. First of all, we've got Richard Wagstaff, President of the NZCTU. Lovely to have you here, Richard.
Kia ora, Brendan.
And we've got Amanda Larsson from Greenpeace, who's the campaigner on climate and energy for that organisation. So lovely to have you here, Amanda.
Kia ora, Brendan.
Great to see you from coming through from our launch as well. So fantastic to have you here. And we've also got Neale Jones, who is joining us from Wellington, and he is the Director of Capital Government Relations and also former Chief of Staff to Andrew Little. So lovely to have you here as well, Neale.
Hey, Brendan.
All right. So let's get straight into it. And the first big policy announcement that came up recently was National's policy around breaks, those being gone by lunchtime. And Richard, what is it with National and getting rid of workers' breaks?
Yeah, look, it's disappointing, but I don't think it's really surprising. National really has a long track record when it comes to employment relations, and they seem to lean against workers and workers' representatives, their unions, and we're seeing that again. I guess a leopard doesn't change its spots, and that's what we're seeing here. It's what we can be certain of, I think, is if National were to be in government, that we would definitely be in for a hard time working people.
Yeah, you can see that, for example, with their extension of the 90-day trial period. They continue to go on about and they continually rehash this policy. I struggle a little bit with it because is there actually any evidence that this sort of policy actually promotes more job creation?
No, there isn't. And in fact, there's evidence to show quite the opposite, because Motu did a study for Treasury in the last period of government and found that it didn't create any jobs or provide any advantage to the disadvantaged, which was meant to be the idea behind it. So it had no beneficial impact on employment. But what we do know is that tens of thousands of people were put on trials, and tens of thousands of them were dismissed either during or after their trial. I think in the last period, I had the figure here, I think 2017-2018 period, something like 80,000 people were taken on a 90-day trial, and over 20,000 of them were laid off during or at the conclusion of the trial. And I think that's really one of the big stories about the 90-day trials, that not only did they not do any good, they arguably did a lot of damage, because I think it's a very responsible thing to employ people. You don't just pick people up and drop them like it doesn't matter. For many people, it's their first time in employment. They're vulnerable. This is a way to knock people's confidence, not to build it. So
and make their work more precarious as well.
Make them vulnerable to all kinds of things, and also set them up for a bad start in life. Because we know work can be very, very good for people, but actually we know bad work is bad for people, and that's what we got here. I think the other point I want to make about the habit of the National Party is, I'm not surprised Collins and Goldsmith are pushing we'll roll back everything Labor did, but I think they'll roll it further back than what we had under Key and English. This is not Key and English. This is a more radical brand of conservative nationalism, National Party. And I think we would see them take employment relations back further towards the Employment Contracts Act days. That's the pedigree. That's what we're seeing in other policies. And I think if we were lucky, we would just end up where we were, and that's not great. But I think likely is, particularly if they had an ACT partner in government, it'll be back to the 90s, and that's something that none of us want to think about.
Yeah, that's quite scary. A key part of, I think, any jobs policy is going to be really having a think about what it looks like when and how climate change is going to be changing employment. It's going to be changing what jobs look like, and it's going to be really key, I think, any employment policy, any jobs policy, making sure that there's some sort of just transition as we move away from those sort of carbon-heavy jobs to more carbon neutral or carbon-free jobs. So, Richard, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, look, I think it's really crucial that if we're going to fundamentally change our economy and our industries, and we do need to do that, we need to get out of carbon, we're going to do it anyway with new technology, that we provide a pathway through that takes everyone with us. And what we want to do, working people want to know that if they're going to change, there's a pathway for them that gets them there safely. And we need a government that is committed to a policy of just transition. And for us, that means we take everyone with us. We don't sort of make the burden on one group of workers having to take the whole burden of change. So even those workers in the oil industry or the carbon industries, we can't just abandon them and expect them to fight for themselves. In my view, what we need as a government approach is the whole society needs to support those workers and their families to move to low carbon jobs. That means possibly active labour market policies, retraining, job creation, all of those kinds of things that support people to move from where they are now into new industries. And as I said, that's important in terms of climate change, but even things like new technology. A lot of those forces, if you like, for the future of work are going to mean industries are going to transform. Let's get behind that transformation, but let's make sure we don't leave people behind. And I think we're seeing the road reforms, we're seeing discussion in the future of work forums with this government, some good steps in that direction, but we need to do a lot more. And it's going to take not a passive state, but an active state. It's going to take the state stepping up and playing a really vital role in taking people with us. And like the Aotea wellbeing commitment, actually putting people first in that transition and not just leaving them to the vagaries of the market.
And when I read the Greenpeace Future is Here report, I get very much a sense, Amanda, that the just transition is a key part of that report.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the important thing to remember about a just transition is climate change is happening and carbon emissions are causing it. And that's a non-negotiable. We have to stop emitting carbon and other greenhouse gases because you can't negotiate with physics. There's no choice. We have to do it. What we do have a choice about is how we move away from it and how we support people through that transition, like Richard was saying. And I think it's really important to make that distinction because the current government has tended to talk about a just transition in a way that is kind of legitimizing a slow transition. And like I said, you can't negotiate with physics. We have to have an urgent move away from high carbon industries. But it is the role of government to make sure that people are supported through that process. And that's workers in high carbon industries. It's also communities that are dependent on high carbon industries. It's also making sure that the employment opportunities in new industries and in clean tech are distributed in a just way as well. So making sure that there's access for different demographics and also making sure that people have good working conditions because there have been cases in the clean energy industry of poor union representation, poor sort of working conditions and so on. So it's moving away from the old in a way that takes people with us, but also moving towards the new in a way that provides good job opportunities, good wages for people and for all people, not just those who tend to be prioritized in job market.
Indeed. Neale, what's your thoughts on just transition?
Look, I think it's really important, as the last two speakers have laid out, that we do ensure a just transition for workers. It is a lot harder than I think we often think. Often governments look to be tokenistic and say, we'll throw you a few million for training and that'll sort you out. We shouldn't underestimate how much it can completely overturn someone's life. If you're a coal miner and you're living on the West Coast and suddenly your house is worth nothing and you're 55 years old and you're told you're going to be a coder, now you're going to learn to code. I mean, that's just nonsense. So we've got to really make sure we put the investment behind looking after communities and families and regions where they're affected. The other point I'd make is it's actually really important for the sustainability politically of climate change policies. Going back to Richard's point, if workers in particular industries and regions feel that they are being made to bear the brunt, they will of course cling to what they've got. They will cling to their oil jobs or their coal jobs because, the alternative is their family being on the scrap heap. So we've got to make sure that we don't have what I call a green Thatcherism, where we say the market of the emission trading system will create this beautiful future and humanity, humans and, people and their families will be left behind in the wreckage. We did that in the 80s with neoliberalism, and we shouldn't do the same thing again through climate change.
Yeah. How possible is it that we're going to that parties can promise X or Y and have a reasonable expectation that they're going to deliver jobs?
Well, it's a tough question to predict anything at the moment, but I think what we can say is that we can predict that doing something will make a difference. And I think, again, a track record is good to look at. If you look at, I've noticed that National tries to be the campaign on jobs. They've done it for a long time now, as though they're the best at creating it. When in fact their record isn't anywhere near as good as what Labour-led governments have been. If you look at pre-pandemic times, in the Clark government, we had unemployment down to record levels, down to under 4%. Then we had the change of government to the last National government, and it crept up. And people will say, well, that was the global financial crisis, but actually New Zealand slipped from being number 2 in the world to being number 14 in the OECD. So we actually, even compared to our OECD comparators, we slipped dramatically when it came to jobs. When we had a return of a Labour Prime Minister in the current government, we saw unemployment plummet back down to the rates that it was, record low unemployment rates like we were back when we had Helen Clark. So that's a real embedded pattern there, which is really encouraging. We also had wage rises and a greater share of the economy, which is also very encouraging. Yeah. Clearly with the pandemic, the numbers are going to be hit. But, if you think about the wage subsidy scheme, I think it's most people would recognise that was tremendously successful as a short-term measure to hold people in jobs. The predictions back then were wild about it being double-digit even and well into the teens for unemployment. We haven't seen anything like that. And the predictions for a collapse in business, there's been some hardships, but it hasn't been the collapse that we've been predicting. I'm pretty sure if we hadn't have had those measures taken, it would have been a lot worse. So I think we can be reasonably confident that doing something will make a difference. Yeah. And we just got to be sensible about what doing the most. What we have heard consistently from the Prime Minister and Grant Robertson is they will not let unemployment spiral out of control on their watch, and I think that's what we've seen. They've prevented that. It appears to me they're determined to keep it that way.
So, Amanda, I think there's an opportunity here for also a climate change lens to be applied to this as well, isn't there?
Yeah, absolutely. The COVID recovery and the kind of amount of funding that we're seeing being put on the table at the moment is the greatest opportunity that I've seen in my lifetime to reorient the economy so that we're working within the natural limits of the climate. So we have a huge opportunity to build the infrastructure that we need to take us to a low carbon economy. So far, I really haven't seen that kind of vision or ambition coming from our political parties this election, though.
Yeah. And I think an example of that is Labour's recently released energy policy, where they promoted the idea that they were going to generate 100% of renewable energy generation by 2030. But then when you actually started to look down in the details, it was something quite different. And I think you guys put down a really good response to that as well, where you described the policy as stingy and needed, and more action is needed. That sounds like, maybe a C+ if they were lucky on that one.
Yeah, the way I've described it is kind of tiptoeing in the right direction when we should be making big, bold strides because, it might look good on paper to say we're going to go to 100% electricity, renewable electricity, but if you look at what the major sources of climate emissions are in New Zealand, it is the agriculture industry and it is also transport. And electricity is only a very small portion of that. So, there's nothing bad about Labour's policy, but it's not targeting the right areas. And at the moment, we are quite clearly in the middle of a climate crisis. California's on fire, the Amazon's on fire. We all remember the Australian bushfires last year. So climate change is kind of knocking on the Labour leader's door, asking, where's this promise of a nuclear-free moment that you offered us last time? And we didn't see it in this policy. What we need to see from the from the major political parties is, what is your plan for transitioning the agriculture system? What is your plan for transitioning the transport system?
Well, National has a plan. National has a plan. I mean, it's a, well, I'd like to say it's bold, but no, it's more reheated old dinner from National, where they're going to repeal the RMA. Goodness me, we haven't heard that one before. Reverse oil and gas exploration ban, and back responsible mining as part of a pragmatic energy policy. Yes, that was... I just couldn't believe that one. I was like, these people, are they even trying? Because then you look and you see they've got the roads, and it's just like roads for a period there. Everything that National announced came with a road.
Yeah, I mean, with reference to the pledge to reverse the offshore oil and gas ban, I mean, that was incredibly disappointing. And it's also strange because in the same week that National made that announcement, the Financial Times and The Economist both put out pieces of analysis saying it's the end of the oil age. You know, COVID combined with climate change concerns has really slammed this industry. And if you're looking for economic growth and if you're looking for jobs, that's not the industry that you should be looking towards. And, you know, clean energy produces around 4 times more jobs than the oil industry. So it kind of calls into question, you know, the economic nous behind that announcement. With regards to the roads, I think, to be fair to National, they've got quite a lot of policy on the table as well for rail, for public transport, for cycling. Their electric vehicles policy, even though, again, I call it tiptoeing, is slightly stronger than what Labour have put out. But as you say, you know, there's a lot of roads in the mix, and we know that building new roads induces more car usage because people use the options made available to them. And if those cars are predominantly gas guzzlers, which, you know, we import 60 times as many gas guzzlers as we do electric vehicles at the moment, then those roads are going to lead to more carbon emissions. So, yeah, we need to see a step change in ambition on climate policy from both of the major parties at the moment.
But what are your thoughts then about the Green Party itself and what it's putting out there as in regards to policy to deal with and to take climate action?
Yeah, from both the Greens and the Māori Party, we've seen some good progressive climate policy. We've seen commitments to ending fossil fuel use, to community energy programs, to working on agriculture in particular, so funding a transition to regenerative farming, dealing with fertilizer and palm kernel expeller, which drive intensification. But I can't say hand on heart that any political party is taking climate change as seriously as it needs to be taken. Yeah. And with those smaller parties as well, it's a question of what are they going to take to the negotiating table if they are asked to form a government, and what will their priorities be? And what we've seen with the Greens in this last term of government was that they backed down on putting agriculture into the emissions trading scheme. So we need to make sure that we're pushing all of our parties to kind of hold firm to their values and to make them bottom lines at the negotiating table as well.
And this is all such a contrast, I think, to the sort of the vision that Greenpeace has been putting forward as part of its The Future is Here report. We've taken a screenshot out of it, just a wealth of information, and I really encourage people to go and have a look at it. Can you just take us through a couple of the key elements of this in regards to, and we chose this one because it was also both about how energy is generated, but also the opportunities that are there in taking climate action.
Yeah, I mean, there are huge opportunities, like you say, in the clean energy transition. So, for example, building public transport creates more jobs than building roads. As I said earlier, clean energy jobs or clean energy produces more jobs per dollar invested than the oil industry. Solar and wind are the fastest growing sources of employment in the United States. They have potential in every town, city, and region in New Zealand. There's 600,000 under-insulated homes in New Zealand that need insulation, and that is heaps of jobs, getting people to work, making houses warmer and drier for people. Not to mention, building railways, cycleways. There's so much potential. I think what we're seeing at the moment is just a more sort of business as usual, same old, when really we have this opportunity with the COVID recovery budget to do some transformational things that are going to be good for the climate, but also good for creating jobs. And, in the case of housing, providing decent housing for people and decent opportunities for people.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the problems we've got with or one of the constraints we've got with this election is that there is this big boogeyman standing behind or over it all called COVID. And it's making it very difficult for, I think, some politicians and parties to get out there and be truly transformative. So I think, Neale, I mean, you've been through a few elections, and we've got some poll results here from over the last couple of years, the trend lines for the various polls, and you can see that the main parties were sort of neck and neck and within a couple of points of each other, and then suddenly COVID comes and there's this massive divergence of political fortunes. And I just wonder, Neale, do you think these poll results are influencing the election, or is it COVID that's influencing the poll results?
Well, I mean, I think they both influence each other. So I think it's clear that COVID has been the key factor here in that divergence in the polling. So it's easy to forget that the last poll publicly before COVID had Simon Bridges leading a government with the ACT Party and Coalition. And while those poll results probably wouldn't have survived an election campaign, I don't think Simon Bridges, given his very low popularity, could have held it. It was a very close race, and Labor was at risk of being out of Parliament. I think what we've seen is that COVID-19 coming along, first of all, there is a rally to the flag effect that happens where people are looking for security and stability in leadership, but how a leader performs really influences that. So Jacinda Ardern's leadership through COVID-19, I think, has kept those poll ratings up. If you look at Trump, for example, he had an initial bump and then he's gone downwards since then because of his poor handling of it. So it's not as simple as saying COVID means the governing party does well and stays doing well. It does require leadership. So I think in that regard, COVID has influenced the polls and the election. I think where the polls have influenced the election has been, if you look at the National Party, Simon Bridges, he fell down because he mishandled his response to COVID-19. When people wanted a leader who was going to be playing, constructive criticism in a crisis, he went overtly political and negative, which rubbed people up the wrong way. Todd Muller fell into the same trap. And eventually, the desperation of low polling led some of his MPs to do stupid things, which he then got caught up in, and that helped lead to his downfall.
Yeah.
And so I think even now, Judith Collins and the fact she is the leader of the National Party, which John Key and Bill English never wanted, it was seen as impossible. In the last leadership run, she got 4 votes in the caucus. The fact she's leader of the National Party shows what extraordinary times we're in. So I think that has influenced the campaign. The disarray National is in, which is keeping Labor high in the polls, again, is a function of that. And I think more broadly, the dullness of the election campaign has been influenced by COVID. I think the fact that we feel like we're not really having much of a policy debate, that the big issues like climate change, which is an existential crisis, they're being discussed, but it's kind of a background issue and it should be at the forefront. And it probably would have been had it not been for COVID. So I think it is definitely influencing, I think, the terrain of the campaign, the fortunes of the parties, and the policies we're discussing.
I also get the sense that there's a moving back from the electorate on the older style of confrontational politics, and that there's a desire perhaps for a more collaborative and empathetic style of politics that perhaps is more favourable towards Jacinda's approach rather than Judith.
Yeah, I think when there is a crisis like COVID-19, we become more collectivist in a sense, in that we realise that we're all in it together and we all have to do our bit and we're all making sacrifices and we've all got to look after each other. And I think in that kind of scenario, a leader who does show empathy and kindness, which Jacinda Ardern and can do very well, is really well suited to the time. I think divisive politics, negative personal politics, I don't think that's what people want in a time of crisis, which probably doesn't help Collins.
Yeah.
Given that strongly her background, I mean, she came into the leadership with a very strong brand for negativity and dirty politics, and that's not really what people want.
No. So do you think, in general, politicians are being bold enough?
Well, no. I mean, in one sense, yes, in that we are seeing tens of billions of dollars borrowed to confront the crisis, which in most normal times would be just fantastical amounts of money to spend. But when you look at the challenge ahead, I think we're not meeting it. To touch on Amanda's points, the big infrastructure program the government's rolling out, for example, it's great that it's going to create jobs, but if you look at the kind of projects, they're the sort of projects the National Party could have done quite easily. There is nothing there to suggest that there is a vision going in to build back better, to actually build a low-emission, fairer economy. I think as well, there are some really big structural issues ahead of us. So if you look at the next 3 years, economists are predicting asset prices are going to inflate dramatically. When you've got very low interest rates, you've got top tax rate and trust rate going apart, and you've got Reserve Bank printing money. What's going to happen is asset prices inflate. At the same time, the pressure is going to come on wages and unemployment's going to go up. And so what the government should be doing is actually taxing those assets and making sure that there's a decent social safety net for people who are out of work. And I get the sense that Labor, because they're polling so high, I think, are looking at holding on to that vote. And many of those voters at about around the 50% mark are core national voters. They're not traditional Labor voters.
Yeah.
So Labor's taking a very centrist line in this election to try and hold that vote. And I think while there's a lot of bold things they are doing that'll make a difference, there's some really fundamental stuff that's being left on the table. Yeah. And only really, in terms of the parties that can viably get into Parliament and make a difference, only the Greens are really raising these issues. And they're looking about 50-50 at the moment whether they get back in or not.
Yeah. I know when we've been looking at scoring the political parties and how they fit in with the Aotearoa Wellbeing Commitment, the Greens easily come out on top because they're the party that are looking at how do we deal with poverty, how do we take climate action, how do we make our tax system more transparent and fairer. So, no, thanks for that, mate. So I think a question for each of you, and we'll start with you, Richard. When you look at the Aotearoa Wellbeing Commitment, how do you see it challenging the status quo in Aotearoa, New Zealand?
Yeah, thanks, Brendan. I think just running on from the answers we just heard from Neale and Amanda, it challenges us to be much bolder, and it challenges us to put people fair and squarely first and move away from the orthodoxy that we've had really for the last 3 or 4 decades, which is profit first effectively, and the economy first and not people. And I think it's really the kind of thinking we absolutely need right now. Many of us have been saying publicly to the political parties, that old saying, don't waste a crisis, and don't put everything back together the way that it was, because actually there were problems with the way that it was. And certainly we tended to have a low-skill, low-wage, high-carbon economy. And if the government's going to be throwing around a lot of money, put some conditions on that, and that is it has to be steered towards the kind of world we want. And, this is a tremendous opportunity to do that. So while COVID might have drowned out climate change in terms of being on the top of everyone's radar to some extent, it has created a massive opportunity to do something different. And I think the Aotearoa Wellbeing Commitment, it does really, it comes at it from another angle and says, let's invest in social infrastructure, not just hard hats and what men do, building bridges and roads. Let's invest in the vital social infrastructure we need that really keep a society going. And I want to just, there's housing, health, education, public sector, income support. All of those things are absolutely critical, but I really like to focus also on connectivity, on internet connectivity. That's such a vital part of holding us all together. And it's interesting how, our forebears thought of it that way. They created the post office. They created telecommunications and extensive postal system because they knew a nation needed that to build and to stick together. Some madness in the 1980s said, actually, we don't need it, let the market do it. And now we have whole tracks of people who are potentially missing out on being connected with the rest of our society and our communities. And I think that's a really great feature of this wellbeing thing. It makes it more than just giving everyone enough to live on, but it's also about providing the means that we can interact effectively as a society. And I think it's highly commendable for that reason. And it really causes a rethink in the fundamentals, which is extremely pleasing.
Oh, thank you. So, Amanda, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I agree with everything that Richard has just said. And I think what the Aotearoa Wellbeing Commitment does is kind of present a rethink of how we run the economy, and that's exactly what we need to be doing now, so that we aren't letting the consequences of the pandemic be made even worse by the fact that we also have a broken economic system. And what Neale was saying earlier, that the early figures coming out of Treasury are showing that asset prices are skyrocketing. People who have property are getting richer. Meanwhile, renters are losing out. People on low wages or unemployed people are losing out. And it's very clear that we're on a trajectory for growing inequality if we stick with a business as usual model. So there could never be a clearer warning sign that we need to move away from that business as usual model. I think Richard said it really well, that this is about providing for people first rather than this kind of nebulous concept of the economy.
And the market, yeah.
Yeah, so I think it's fantastic, yeah.
Neale?
Look, I agree with what Amanda and Richard have both said. I think it does pose a really stark choice this election, which is that with the Labour and Green government, which is what I would hope we have after the election, there's a chance that we have the investment in public services, a government that's willing to actually borrow at times of record low interest rates to make sure that we are maintaining our public services, as you've outlined, that we're actually making sure that we have infrastructure programs that create jobs. And I would hope the Greens would add some more there around making sure there's that social safety net of increased welfare, and a greater climate focus. I think with the National Party, the risk we face is they have a great austerity program. They're looking to cut tens of billions of dollars of new spending out of our public services. And we saw what happened in the last 9 years in, say, our health system, for example, where $2.3 billion was underfunded and didn't keep up with need. We're going to see that on steroids under National if they get in again. So we've got to make sure, I think, this election that, we've got to keep campaigning on these issues, and there's a role for unions and other organisations to push them up. But the foundation of that the next month has to be a Labour-Green government.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. So, with that in mind, sorry, Richard.
Go on. I was just going to say, and just further to what Neale's saying, some of the slogans we're hearing, like "do more for less," and all these silly ideas about somehow you can have your cake and eat it too from the Conservative parties, from ACT and National, really need to be challenged. Their idea that you can go back to an orthodoxy, reduce government spending, and somehow have greater outcomes than you would. It just doesn't add up, and need to be called on that. It's just irrational and illogical, but they keep at it because it's kind of, they've got away with it for so long.
But Richard, the market will provide. We'll just target it more.
Yeah. It's strange, but actually you do less with less and more with more. Who knew?
Yeah, surely there's a law of thermodynamics around that. Well, look, hey, thank you so much for joining us on our panel today. It's been fantastic to get your views and your thoughts on the policies that have been released recently. And as always, for those of you who are watching, make sure that you're sharing our stuff on social media so that we can get our message out there about the importance of the Aotearoa Wellbeing Commitment, and sign up to get your friends, family, whānau enrolled and voting, and also make sure you send in your postcards to the leader of the political party you want you think is going to form the next government, telling them that they should support the Aotearoa Wellbeing Commitment. So look, I just want to say thank you, Richard, Amanda and Neale. It's been great having you on here, and until next time, ka kite anō.